A time when truth, even when whispered by a single voice, has the power to echo louder than the lies of empires. In a world where power is often measured by wealth, weapons, or international approval, a different kind of power, quiet, defiant, raw, emerges from the hearts of those who have nothing to lose but their chains. And now, that voice is spoken. In a moment that sent shockwaves across continents, a young man stood in front of cameras, not to ask for sympathy, not to defend his actions, but to tell the world the truth it refused to see. His words did not follow political scripts. They carried fire. They carried the pain of generation. They carried the courage of a soul who chose the path of resistance over the comfort of submission. He did not blink. He did not beg. He did not break. And as millions watched, something ancient stirred. A memory of other voices that once rang out across the ages. Do you remember the 26-year-old who stood in front of colonial powers and said, "You cannot kill ideas"? That was in 1987. That voice was silenced with bullets, but the idea, his dream, still burns. Do you remember a little island in the Caribbean where a lawyer with no army stared down an empire? His name was Fidel. They called him crazy, they called him a rebel, but in the end they had to call him commander. Do you remember the barefoot men and women in Vietnam who faced B-52 bombers with nothing but their belief that freedom was worth dying for? History is not built by the comfortable. It is not written by the cowardly. It is forged by fire, by sacrifice, by the stubborn will of those who choose dignity over survival. And that is what the world witnessed. A man not older than many of the soldiers he leads, refusing to be a puppet, refusing to be quiet, refusing to allow foreign hands to dig into the soil of his homeland any longer. His voice cracked with emotion, not weakness. His words were sharp, not because of hate, but because of love for his people, his soil, his ancestors. He spoke for the child with dust on his face, selling peanuts at the roadside. He spoke for the mother who lost her son to a war that was never hers. He spoke for the farmers whose land was soaked in sweat and stolen minerals. The world had grown used to leaders who kneel, so when one stood up it terrified them. They say bravery is facing bullets, but sometimes the greatest bravery is speaking the truth when it could cost you everything. It is walking into the lion's den not with a sword but with a mirror, forcing the world to look at its reflection. And, in doing so, he broke something. He broke the silence. He broke the illusion. He broke the rules of the game. But he also broke the internet. Not because of drama, but because people are starved for honesty. Because deep down, in villages, in cities, in refugee camps, in war zones, in the hearts of the forgotten people felt seen. They recognized something in him. A warrior, a brother, a leader not manufactured, but born in the ashes of struggle. And now others are rising. In West Africa, flags are changing. In streets, songs of freedom are returning. In schools, children are saying, "Maybe we can be free too." This is not a rebellion, it is a renaissance. But freedom has never been free. For every Patrice who dreams, there is a bullet waiting. For every Sankora who speaks, there is betrayal lurking. For every revolution, there is blood, there is fear, there is sacrifice. Yet the question remains, if not now, when? If not us, who? What we saw was not just an interview, it was a declaration. A young man with the weight of a nation on his shoulders told the world, "We are not afraid anymore." And in doing so, he gave permission to millions to stop being afraid too. This is not the end of a story. This is the beginning of a storm. Let the world tremble, let empires prepare, because history has shown us again and again that when the people rise, when the youth awaken, when truth is spoken from the mouth of the brave, not even the gates of hell can stop a revolution whose time has come. And in this world where injustice is wrapped in diplomacy, where oppression hides behind smiling suits, and where truth is traded like currency, remaining silent is no longer an option. There are moments in history when a single voice breaks through the noise, carrying not just words but wounds, centuries deep. That voice has spoken. It wasn't the voice of a polished politician or a man trained to please cameras. It was raw, it was fierce, it was filled with the pain of the forgotten. Every sentence cracked with weight, every pause echoed with a truth too long buried. He did not raise his voice to be heard, yet the world listened, because what he said came from the place that cannot be taught, conviction. He did not speak with anger, but with the sorrow of 1,000 mothers who buried their sons in silent wars. He spoke with the fire of a child who never got to know peace, and the tears of old men who watched their nations carved up and sold. His voice didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to the people, to those who've been used, lied to, and left behind. He spoke for the barefoot child walking miles to school under the sun. He spoke for the woman whose husband disappeared into a mine digging riches that would never belong to them. He spoke for the farmer who stood on land that grew gold but couldn't feed his family. And when he spoke, millions felt something they hadn't felt in years: hope and rage. Because the world has grown used to leaders who bow quietly, who sign papers in the dark, while their people suffer in the light. But then, from the dust of despair, someone stood, not as a king but as a soldier, not to beg, but to declare. He reminded the Veer that freedom does not ask permission, that dignity is not given, it is seized. He stood like those before him, the ones history tried to erase, the dreamers, the fighters, the ones who spoke the truth and paid with their lives. Do you remember the young man who said, "He who feeds you controls you"? He was silenced, but his words became seeds, and now one of those seeds is grown. This is not just politics, this is personal. Because when you've watched your land stripped bare, when you've seen your brothers turned into beggars, when you've buried children who died in conflicts they never started, then truth becomes sacred, and speaking it becomes an act of war. Sometimes the greatest bravery is not walking into bullets, but standing alone, unshaken, with nothing but truth in your hands. And that's what the world witnessed. A storm began with a whisper, and in that whisper was the rage of a continent, the cry of the youth, the song of resistance. For too long people have been told to wait, that freedom must come slowly, but now they are learning what he showed. If you don't stand up, you will never be free. This is not a rebellion, this is a rebirth. It is the sound of chains breaking, not from violence but from courage, and it will not stop, because courage is contagious. His words sparked fire in those who thought the flame was gone. Now the streets are singing, flags are rising, eyes are opening. He reminded the world that history is not only written by the victors, it is rewritten by the brave. This is not the end, it's the beginning of a storm. And let the world tremble, because not even the gates of hell can stop a revolution whose time has come. His voice did not tremble from rage, but from something deeper, something older, a wound passed down like a curse. His words were not laced with hatred, but soaked in sorrow, a sorrow inherited from those who came before him, the kind of sorrow that lives in silence, in stories whispered by grandmothers who survived, in eyes of fathers who never looked free, in the blood that remembers even when the mind forgets. What he said was not just a statement, it was a cry that carried centuries. It came from the ruins of kingdoms broken by foreign greed, from lands once whole that were carved like meat at a banquet, from languages silenced and renamed, from names replaced by numbers. When he spoke, you could hear it all: the rusted chains, the whip, the gunships, the stolen gold, the smiling lies of foreign flags. He was not speaking for himself. He was carrying the weight of those who never got the chance, the ones whose stories were erased, whose resistance was buried. This wasn't politics, this wasn't policy, this was personal. Because how can it not be personal when your very soil has been taken from under your feet, when your people again and again are told they are poor in a land that makes the world rich? He didn't point fingers out of bitterness, he told truths out of duty. He did not cry for pity, he spoke so the bones beneath the earth could finally rest. The world often asks why the oppressed are angry, but when someone speaks without anger, just pain, it becomes even harder to ignore, because pain speaks the language of the human soul, and his soul was full of ghosts. You could feel the voices of the past in every sentence. The voice of the mother in the village, who watched her son forced into a war that had nothing to do with his future. The voice of the miner who never made it out of the shaft, digging wealth he would never touch. The voice of the teacher who tried to educate a generation only to tone his curriculum, written by strangers. All of them were there, in him, through him. There was no script in his words, no performance, just truth. And truth, when spoken from that depth, is dangerous. Not because it incites violence, but because it reveals what so many have tried to hide, that freedom was never given, that independence was often just a flag without power, that even today the hands that once held the chains now write the contracts. He stood as a bridge between the buried past and the broken present. He held up a mirror, not only to his own people, but to the entire world. And what it showed was uncomfortable. It showed the scars of forced borders, the consequences of economic puppetry, the reality of military influence masked as aid. He was not a rebel. He was a witness, a vessel for memory. And yet, in all that pain, he offered not despair but strength, because to carry that weight and still speak without bitterness, that is power, that is healing, that is resistance in its most human form. He did not demand revenge. He demanded recognition. He demanded dignity. He demanded a future where children would no longer have to carry this pain, where they could finally be proud not only of their land but of their leaders. He reminded the world that pain can either consume you or transform you, And in his case it became a flame, a quiet, steady fire that will light the way for others who have long walked in the dark. Because when one person dares to speak the pain of millions, something shifts, a silence breaks, a wound begins to close, and history begins to turn. Not the kind of pain you shout with, but the kind that lives in your bones, the kind that moves with you, even when you think you've escaped it, the kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. His words came slowly, not like a speech prepared to impress, but like truth pulled from the weight of centuries. You could hear it not in how loud he spoke, but in what he refused to hold back. This pain wasn't his alone, it was too old, too deep, too wide. It was the pain of stolen names and rewritten histories. It was the pain of ancestors who tilled the land but never owned it. The pain of seeing their stories replaced, their memories erased, their value reduced to what could be taken from them. This pain came from fields of gold where the only ones growing rich were the ones who didn't belong to the land. It came from children who grew up never knowing why their homes were poor, even though their soil was rich. His words opened a door to that silence, the one passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son. The silence that teaches you to survive without asking why. But he asked, and when he did, the world wasn't ready, because he didn't come as a victim. He came as a witness, and witnesses don't beg. They remember. They hold the truth like a blade. In every sentence there was a memory of flags that changed but chains that didn't, of treaties signed with smiles but backed by threats, of aid that came with strings and democracy that came with instruction. He remembered the young men lost in wars they didn't choose, the mothers who cried without cameras watching, the dreams swallowed by hunger and silence, and when he spoke he made sure the world saw them too. There was no anger, just exhaustion, that heavy, bitter exhaustion of a people asked to wait for freedom that never comes, who are told to trust systems that have only ever betrayed them, whose resistance is always labeled dangerous while their exploitation is called development. That's what made his voice so powerful, because he didn't have to scream to make the world uncomfortable. He only had to tell the truth. And yet within that pain, there was something even more dangerous, dignity. He stood with a kind of quiet pride that can't be bought or silenced. He didn't need permission to speak. He had earned his voice through struggle, through sacrifice, through loyalty to something bigger than himself. The world isn't used to seeing men like him stand tall without fear. They expect obedience, they expect compromise, but what they saw instead was someone who refused to forget. He was not interested in revenge. He was interested in restoration. He didn't call for blood, he called for justice, for a kind of healing that can only begin when truth is spoken fully, without apology. And that's why his words spread like fire. Because people everywhere, those whose pain had been buried, those who thought they were alone, finally heard themselves. In his voice they found their own. He showed that pain can be power when it is no longer hidden, that the weight of the past, when carried with courage, becomes the fuel for something greater. He was not just speaking. He was lifting the voices of those who came before and making sure they would never be silenced again. And in doing so, he reminded the world that the wounds of history are not healed by forgetting, but by remembering, by honoring, and by daring to build something better in their name. They had grown used to leaders who kneel, so when one stood up, it terrified them. The world had adjusted to a certain image. Leaders from lands scarred by colonization arriving in suits, smiling for cameras, shaking hands with those who once held their people in chains, bowing, not out of respect, but out of survival, reading speeches they didn't write, signing deals they didn't create, speaking languages they were forced to learn, and calling it diplomacy. For too long this was the posture of power, heads down, voices low, eyes always seeking approval. So when someone stood, truly stood, it wasn't just unexpected, it was a threat. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to disturb the balance. The old order, the comfortable arrangement built on quiet obedience, was not ready for a man who refused to kneel. They had gotten used to submission disguised as cooperation. They had become comfortable with control that looked like partnership. But he shattered that illusion the moment he refused to play along. He stood not with arrogance but with clarity. He stood not against anyone but for something, for dignity, for truth, for his people. That kind of courage is dangerous, because courage, real courage, is contagious. It breaks something open inside those who've been living with their heads down. It makes them ask questions they were never allowed to ask. And the most dangerous question of all, why are we still kneeling? That's the question that echoed through villages, through cities, through the hearts of the young watching online. Why are we still waiting for permission to be free? Why are we still begging for help from those who helped create the suffering in the first place? Why are we still told to be patient when the cost of patience has been hunger, war, and silence? When he stood, he held up a mirror. not just to the world outside but to his own people. And what it reflected was hard to look at, because kneeling becomes a habit, it becomes culture, it becomes normal. And standing up begins to feel like rebellion, even treason. That's why his act, so simple, so human, was also so revolutionary. He did not ask for permission to speak. He did not apologize for rejecting exploitation. He did not soften his voice to make others comfortable. And because of that, they called him dangerous. They labeled him a threat. But the truth is, they weren't afraid of violence. They were afraid of example. They were afraid others would follow. Because when one person stands, others realize they can too. And now, they are standing. You can see it in the eyes of young people who once felt hopeless. You can hear it in the chants rising from the streets. You can feel it in the silence of the powerful, now unsure how to respond. Something is shifting. The ground is moving. The posture is changing. He showed that leadership is not about pleasing the powerful, it's about protecting the powerless. And when that kind of leader rises, he doesn't just change policies, he changes the atmosphere. He makes people believe again, believe that their suffering is not normal, that their voice matters, that their future is still theirs to shape. And yes, that terrifies those who built their empires on silence. They had grown used to leaders who bowed, who followed, who said yes. So when someone finally stood up, not for applause, not for fame, but out of love for truth and justice, it shook the room. It disturbed the system. It made people remember that true power doesn't come from outside approval. It comes from within. And once awakened, it cannot be put back to sleep. The world is watching now not just because of what he said, but because of how he stood. And in that simple act, he gave millions permission to rise. Sometimes the greatest bravery is not facing bullets, but telling the truth that could cost you everything. Because a bullet kills the body, but truth, it threatens empires. It shakes foundations built on lies. It exposes the hidden hands behind suffering. It asks questions that make those in power uncomfortable. It gives voice to the voiceless, and in doing so, it makes silence impossible. That kind of bravery doesn't come with medals. It comes with exile, with threats, with isolation. And yet, some still choose it. He chose it. Not because it was safe, not because it would be celebrated, but because it was right. And in that moment when he opened his mouth and refused to recite the script, when he spoke not what was allowed but what was necessary, he stepped into a different kind of battlefield. One where the weapons are not guns, but words. One where your enemy is not seen but felt, watched from behind polished desks, listening, calculating, and still he spoke. He spoke knowing that truth is expensive. That in this world to tell the truth as a leader is to risk everything, your position, your safety, your future, because truth disrupts, it breaks the masks, it exposes the game. And those who have benefited from silence will never welcome the sound of honesty. But he did not care. Because what does it mean to live in fear while your people suffer in silence? What is leadership if not the courage to name what others are too afraid to say? It would have been easier to stay quiet, to do what many before him did. Smile, sign, bow. He could have had peace, protection, power. But he chose something higher. He chose truth. And by doing so, he redefined what bravery looks like. It's not always on the front lines. Sometimes it's sitting across from the world, knowing every word you say could make you a target. It's choosing to tell the story of your people, not the one approved by outsiders, but the real one, raw, painful, unfinished. That is sacred. That is resistance. And that kind of truth-telling is not just courageous, it's contagious. Because when people hear a truth that matches their pain, something shifts. They feel seen, they feel awakened, they remember, and then they begin to speak too. That is why truth is feared. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the fire they light in others. One spark is all it takes. He was that spark. He didn't shout, he didn't insult, he didn't blame. He just told the truth, and the room changed. The air changed. The world watched, not just with surprise, but with awe. Because deep down we all know how rare it is. In a time when power is protected by lies, truth becomes rebellion. And in a time when speaking out can destroy you, choosing to speak becomes the ultimate act of bravery. Not everyone will understand it. Some will call it dangerous. Others will try to discredit it. But those who've lived in silence will recognize it instantly. Because truth has a sound. It has a weight. And when it's spoken from the heart, it cannot be denied. He didn't have to face a battlefield. He stood on one every time he opened his mouth. And he did it not for glory but because the truth had waited long enough. That is what makes him brave. Not just the words but the price he was willing to pay for them. And in a world drowning in dishonesty, one honest voice, calm, steady, unafraid, is more powerful than an army. And that choice, so rare, so costly, is what set him apart. Survival is what we are all born to do. It is instinct. It is in our blood. Every living thing knows how to survive. Bend when the storm comes. Stay quiet when danger is near. Play by the rules, even if those rules were never made for you. That is how people have learned to exist under oppression. That is how entire nations have learned to breathe beneath the weight of exploitation. But to choose dignity over survival, that is something else. That is not instinct. That is not easy. That is not safe. That is a decision that can cost you everything. And yet he chose it. He stood when it would have been easier to stay down. He spoke when silence would have protected him. He walked the path of truth, fully aware it could lead to exile, to isolation, even to death. But he could no longer accept a life where survival meant swallowing the shame of being owned, controlled, used. He knew that survival without honor is not truly living, and so he chose another way. He chose to walk in the footsteps of those whose stories were buried because they dared to stand tall. He chose to speak with the voice of his ancestors, the ones who had their dignity stripped from them, but still found a way to pass it down. He chose not to bow, not to wealth, not to power, not to fear, because he understood that sometimes to live with your head high means accepting that your life may not be long, but it will be meaningful. And there is something deeply sacred in that choice, because we live in a world where compromise is survival, where people are told to be practical, to stay quiet, to take what they can and not ask for more, where systems are designed to reward obedience and punish pride. In that world, dignity becomes a dangerous act, but he carried it like a weapon, not to attack, but to defend what is right, to show others that it is still possible to live with your soul intact, even in a broken world. When he spoke, you could hear it, the weight of that decision, the strength it took, not to run but to stand, not to agree but to resist, not to take the easy way but the honest one. There was no act in his voice, no script, no mask, just a man who had made peace with the cost of being free. And that is why people listened, because they saw something in him they had almost forgotten existed, a kind of leadership not built on fear, not built on money, not built on foreign approval, but built on conviction, built on the belief that dignity is not a luxury, it is a right, it is the heart of what makes us human, and to protect it, even when the world demands that you give it up, is the purest kind of courage. He could have survived by playing the game, by being quiet, by shaking the right hands and repeating the right lines, but he chose to be a man, not a puppet, a voice, not an echo, and in doing so he gave millions a reason to believe again. Not just in him, but in themselves. Because when someone risks everything for dignity, it reminds us of what we've lost and what we can still reclaim. It reminds us that true strength does not come from power but from principle, and that sometimes the greatest legacy you can leave behind is not survival but the memory of a soul that refused to kneel. That is how change begins, not in grand speeches or violent battles but in the quiet, unshakable courage of one who chooses dignity and dares to carry it alone. It is one of the cruelest truths of our time, that those who dare to dream for their people often do not live to see those dreams fulfilled. History has carved their names into stone, but not before trying to erase them with violence. They do not fall because they were weak. They fall because they were strong enough to stand when it mattered most. He carried that truth with him. He knew what it meant to speak out, to challenge the hands that have controlled his people for generations. He knew the cost, and yet, like those before him, he walked straight into the storm, not for himself but for those who could not. He had seen what happened to dreamers. He had read their stories, walked on the same soil they bled into, and still he chose the same path. Because what is a life if it is lived in fear? What is leadership if it is not willing to risk everything for justice? There is grief in knowing that the most powerful voices are often silenced too soon. But there is also pride, a deep, burning pride in knowing that they were not afraid. They were not bought. They were not broken. Their blood became seeds. Their sacrifice became memory. Their silence became a roar. And now through him, their voices rise again. He is a reminder that freedom is not given, it is fought for. And those who fight may fall, but they do not disappear. They live in the courage of the next voice, the next step, the next stand. For every Patrice who dreams, there is a bullet waiting, but there is also a generation rising. It is not just the sound of protest, it is the heartbeat of a people remembering who they are. This is not simply resistance against something broken. It is the birth of something new, something ancient being restored. It is not about tearing down, it is about rising up. For too long the world has mistaken the cries of the oppressed as chaos, as noise, as trouble. But this moment is not noise, it is music. It is rhythm returning to a land where silence was forced. The voices rising now are not angry echoes. They are ancestral songs, breaking through generations of silence, and they are not asking for pity, they are declaring their place in the world. What we see is not rebellion, it is memory awakening. This is what makes it powerful, this is what makes it sacred, because when a people begin to remember their worth, their history, their dignity, it cannot be stopped. No army, no propaganda, no foreign hand can bury the truth once it has been reborn in the hearts of the people. And that is what this is, a rebirth, a spiritual fire. He stood not to destroy but to rebuild, not to divide but to unite what was once whole. His voice did not call for war, it called for restoration. And when the world heard it, it recognized something too deep to deny. This is bigger than politics. This is culture reclaiming itself. This is identity no longer ashamed. This is the moment when the oppressed no longer beg to be seen. They begin to see themselves. This is not a rebellion, it is a renaissance. And no one, not even those who fear it, can stop what has already begun. When he spoke those words, he wasn't closing a chapter, he was opening a floodgate. He wasn't signaling defeat or surrender, he was warning that the calm before the storm was over. What people thought was the conclusion was only the spark that would ignite something far greater, a storm that would shake the foundations long held sacred by those who benefit from silence and submission. The fight, he made clear, was far from finished. It was merely waking up, gathering strength, like thunder rolling across the horizon. It was a call to everyone who had been waiting for permission to rise, for a reason to stand. This was that reason. This was that moment. He knew well that change doesn't come quietly. It comes with chaos, with disruption, with voices raised and walls broken. It comes with uncertainty and sacrifice. But it also comes with hope. A fierce, unstoppable hope that drives people forward when the night feels endless. That hope is the storm. And storms don't ask for permission, they don't wait for approval, they arrive with force, reshaping everything in their path. This storm was not just about one man, one voice, one movement. It was about the countless souls who refused to stay silent any longer. The millions who carry the weight of history and pain and still dare to dream of something better. So this is not the end, it is the roar before the lightning. It is the gathering wind that will sweep away what no longer serves justice or dignity. The fight is just beginning, and with it comes a promise. Those who have been invisible will be seen. Those who have been silenced will be heard. The storm has arrived, and it will not pass quietly. Let the world tremble, because not even the gates of hell can stop a revolution whose time has come. These words carry the weight of history and the fire of destiny. They are not just a statement. They are a proclamation, a challenge to those who think power is permanent, who believe fear can hold back the tide of change. The time has come, and nothing, no force, no threat, no darkness can stop what is already in motion. This is not a mere protest or fleeting outcry. This is a revolution born from years of pain, struggle, and unwavering hope. It is the moment when a people rise, not because they want to fight, but because they refuse to live any longer under injustice. It is a sacred promise that echoes through generations, a call that has been whispered by every ancestor who dared to dream of freedom. The gates of hell, representing every obstacle, every danger, every enemy, stand powerless before this unstoppable force. They may try to break spirits, to silence voices, to crush movements, but the revolution has a heartbeat that no darkness can drown. It is alive in the courage of those who stand tall when others bend, in the fire of those who speak truth when lies surround them. When he spoke these words, he gave not just hope but power. Power to the weary, strength to the frightened, and courage to those who have long been told to wait. The world may tremble because it senses that something irreversible is happening, something holy, something fierce. This is a call to action, to rise with anger and hope entwined, to fight not just with fists, but with unshakable belief that justice will come. This revolution has come, and nothing will stop it now.